It is August 10th, 2022, and you are listening to the Living Youth Podcast. My name is Wallace Smith, and I have the privilege here to be with a guest co-host. Mr. Robinson could not be with us today, so I have a John Robinson-approved co-host with me today, Mr. Mark Sandor. Mr. Mark Sandor, tell everybody hello.
Hello, good morning, everyone.
Hey, good morning, or good evening, or good afternoon. True. It's morning for us. Our topic today, which, given that Mr. Sandor and I both did not grow up in the church, we thought would be interesting. We plan on discussing what we wish we'd known in our unchurched youth. So let's get after it. Sandor. Thank you, Jake and Julia. And again, welcome to the podcast. And welcome to Mr. Mark Sandor. Very excited that he's here. Sorry that Mr. Robinson is not here. He is feeling under the weather, though we are currently in his office. Could go rifling through the desk drawers and everything if we want to, and he'd have no idea. He'd be none the wiser.
No, and who knows what we might pick up while we're doing it. Are we in the sick room right
that's
here?
True. I need to think about that. Well, if he's left any germs here for us. But anyway, Mr. Robinson, if you're happy to listen to this, of course, we love you, we miss you, and Mr. Sandor is doing a fine job filling in so far in the first 2 minutes of the podcast. Mr. Sandor, you are in town. Why are you even in town? I mean, I'm happy you're in town.
Yes.
But maybe you could share with our listeners why you're in town.
Sure. We are actually on a multi-week trip for our family. Let's see, what have we been doing this whole time? The biggest chunk of it was at the West Virginia preteen camp with boy number 2, Sandor boy number 2, being a 12-year-old finishing out his preteen camp days in West Virginia. But we also have a lot of family in North and South Carolina, so we were hoping to visit them. And then there was also a wedding this last Sunday where 2 of the brethren up in Minneapolis who have some North Carolina connections got married down here, so it was a privilege to be able to conduct that wedding. And now just spend a day or two at the office before we head back to Wisconsin.
Oh, good. I was so glad that you guys are here. I always enjoyed the fact when you were closer in Virginia, then you so rudely allowed yourself to be assigned further away instead of rebelling. No, I'm glad you didn't rebel, Mr. Sandor. Well, for those of you listening, our teens and young adults, we thought in particular this would be a good time to take advantage. We're hoping to make 2 of these podcasts. So if you listen to the next podcast and it's back to me and Mr. Robinson, you'll know that we failed. But Mr. Sandor and I are hoping to get 2 podcasts recorded. This one in particular, we thought would be interesting because Mr. Sandor and I we did not grow up in the church. And so we often have the opportunity to think and reflect on what we know now that we wish we had known back when we did. Now, in my case, and it'd be probably good, Mr. Sandor and I talked about this beforehand, maybe for us to set up both of our circumstances. I began watching the telecast when I was 14. I think I've said that before in sermons. I won't belabor the point a whole lot. But a lot of that was still just learning, and it was just the telecast. Now, I did start getting booklets, so I was starting to read the booklets, but nothing like actual Sabbath service attendance. And I didn't really begin attending the church until I was 18, on the verge of 19, but I was 18. And so my entire, and I'm the only person in my family who is in this faith. While I had loving parents for whom I'm very grateful, and a sister for whom I'm grateful now. It's amazing when you're younger, you don't always appreciate that sibling like you should. But still, I did not have the things I know now, and it's easy for me sometimes, looking at even the things I wrestle with now as an adult, that I wish I had known those things before. Mr. Sandor, what's your story?
Right, I also was not raised in the church. I was raised in a mainstream Protestant church, and let's see, I guess I would have started attending when I was 20. It was right at the beginning of 2021, and so those of you who want to do the math on that can figure out the approximate year I was born. But let's see, so I got to college. That was actually the big turning point for me. I did not ever see the telecast. I had never read church literature. My first contact was actually through a family who was attending the Living Church of God, and they moved in to the high school. I was already attending that high school in Iowa, and a family moved in who had some children, one who was in my grade, still a very good friend to this day. And we got talking when we went to separate colleges, And as things went, I found that I could not defend the mainstream Protestant faith that I was a part of.
Rhymes with schmootherin.
Yes,
right?
yes. And there's reasons that going back to the Midwest, I recognize a lot of the worldly culture, since that's the kind of predominant church up in some of these areas. But yes, I was talking with him and started to realize that my understanding of the scriptures was woefully inadequate. And so at about age 20, I started reading some church literature, but I was actually doing a lot of that. Thankfully, I believe it was actually Mr. Weston who gave approval for me to start attending services. That was my friend decided to get approval from his pastor, and his pastor at that point was Mr. Weston when he was still back in Kansas City.
Oh wow! How about that? So we can blame Mr. Weston for your being allowed to attend.
Pretty much every fault I bring to the table, I think we could potentially do that. So that worked out, and then I've been attending ever since. But to your point, was only had the barest of biblical understanding, I would say, by the time I was 20 years old.
Oh, okay. Well, again, why we thought this would be helpful is most of you listening, our teenage and young adult audience, do have the opportunity or have had the opportunity to grow up close to the tree of knowledge, not being cut off from it, but actually getting to partake of it, to enjoy being in the presence of the truth. And what we wish we could do is take our appreciation for what we know now and kind of go back in time and sort of inject it, if you will, kind of sneak up behind our old selves and stick a syringe of truth in our necks. And I don't know, that sounds terrible. Why am I using such a terrible analogy, Mr. Sandor? But we do wish we could somehow go back and communicate all this to ourselves. And hopefully in discussing these things, you will be encouraged to embrace the things you're learning in your youth, so you don't have to be like us and wish you had actually acted on them then. I thought I would start things off, and we've compared lists before the program. We actually find that many of our things coincide. And this, by the way, these are not complete lists. In fact, all of you probably know us and might think, well, hey, you're also terrible in this way. Don't you wish you could change that way?
Sure. I would have loved to have invested in Amazon. That would have been one that I could go back and tell my teenage self. But
that's right.
I'll leave that one off.
Go back and talk to that nerd Bill Gates,
yes,
back when everybody was making fun of him. So anyway, this is not a complete list, but these are the things that we thought would be worth bringing up, at least today. First, I wish I had back when I was younger, before being associated with the church, I wish I had known about the church's encouragement to approach dating and relationships with girls, in my case, because I'm a boy, differently than what I had. I grew up where it was, honestly, you felt kind of out if you didn't have a boyfriend or girlfriend, in my case, girlfriend. And so consequently, I was always looking for that opportunity to, I'm going to say, go steady. I don't know what the word is today, but I got to be honest, go steady was old even in my day, and we did not say going steady, but for some reason that's the phrase. You're younger than I am, Mr. Sandor. Was there a phrase for having a boyfriend, a steady boyfriend and girlfriend when you were younger? Special phrase.
That is tricky for me to remember. I feel like it was just maybe the going out with somebody.
Going out with someone.
Oh, we go out together.
We used the phrase going with. Oh, are you going with so and so? And you're not going anywhere in particular. You were just going with them. That was your boyfriend, girlfriend. Regardless, the words boyfriend, girlfriend are still there. And I as a result, girls eventually discovered me in high school. I had a series of kind of long-term girlfriends, if you will. We'll say long-term, not really, because what I know now is that in a sense you're sort of practicing divorce. God doesn't, there's so much I didn't learn back then. In terms of course, I would have really stood out from the others of my age because nobody was doing this. Everybody just wanted a boyfriend or girlfriend. But the idea it was socially lazy. Right? You don't need to worry about who you're going out to homecoming with. You don't need to worry about who might want to go to Dairy Queen with you. Went to Dairy Queen a lot back in my hometown for ice cream or for whatever, because it's always that person. They're just sort of the one wearing your class ring on their finger. Back when I eventually got a class ring, and I wish I had not done that. I can think back now that I'm not going to go into a whole lot of details. I don't think that's really necessary. But if I could go back time and just kind of shake Wally around a little bit, shake myself around and say, hey, look, look at actually these nice girls over there that probably haven't been asked out. Why don't you actually ask one of them out to go get some ice cream? Why don't you go, ask these people out and go to some ice cream? Now, again, growing up in the world, that wasn't a part of my culture back then. They might have thought I was a player. What do they say these days? Are you hip enough, Mr. Sandor? No. Are you a player?
Oh, you'd be surprised how unhip I am, actually, Mr. Smith. No, I'm not sure I'm quite the hip person that I play on TV, if you will. What would they say? I know that you're not supposed to hate the player. You're supposed to hate the game. Or is that it? Don't hate the game. That probably is
related.
I don't know. That might actually be sports.
We're just fumbling around, but regardless, you probably understand my point.
I believe so.
That I wish like what we try to teach kids at camp to you're young. Focus on putting the things in your life upon which you will build the rest of your life. This is your time to seek out those things you need to have in place that will make for a fantastic life as an adult. And having just, in my case, this kind of one steady girlfriend for this long period of time, honestly, I would say those cases, just in terms of my social development, and probably for them too, did more harm than good. I wasn't learning about, like for instance, my wife, the woman I married, other than being beautiful, she really was very different than really the girls that I went steady with earlier. I'd even discover her type, if you will, until then, and so I'm so grateful that I did. But that's just one thing for me that I wish I could go back and tell myself I wish I had known the church's teaching, what we try to help impress upon younger people about the vanity of seeking out a boyfriend or a girlfriend and kind of being lazy in terms of social relationships that way.
I believe this is one where we actually had some overlap. I had phrased it that my parents had helped me avoid landmines, and specifically one of the landmines that I know they helped me avoid was improper dating. I think my parents kind of benefited from the fact that I did not necessarily have a ton of confidence in relation to girls while I was in high school. I had a decent amount of confidence that I could be a good friend to them. I had very little confidence that any of them would want me as a boyfriend. That, I don't think, my parents never really tried to push too much on that. I did eventually end up with a girlfriend at one point, though, and I remember we were going to go, talk in my bedroom or something along these lines, and my dad basically said, yeah, you're absolutely not doing that. You are not going to be alone together in a bedroom or something along those lines. And at that time, I was not real pleased that my dad was setting down the lines like that, but I look back on it and think, yeah, he was helping me avoid some landmines at that time of my life.
So right, he saw a potentially dangerous situation
yes.
coming up, regardless of your intentions.
Yes.
And you were resentful at the time, but now you look back and you wish you hadn't been.
Well, and especially because in the moment, I was very much like, well, we're just going to talk, or we're just going to be holding hands, or we're going to be, I did not think anything would lead towards sinfulness, even from, perhaps a Protestant point of view at that point in my life. My dad didn't quite see it that way. He sort of saw like, sin lies at the door, sort of a type of phrase, I guess, from Genesis.
But Mr. Weston's unshakable, unbreakable.
Yes, absolutely. And thankfully my dad had some of those kind of mindsets himself. And so when I pushed back, I found myself up against what's one of the books that we sometimes recommend, that there's a man of steel, man of velvet. I've not actually read the book, but I like the title because I think it implies,
I think Dr. O'Neill brings that one up.
Right, as men, we should have a characteristic of being steel-like in certain situations, a characteristic of being velvet-like. And my dad could usually be very kind and very, very velvety, if you will. But he was steel at that moment. That was me trying to push back and found out, this is where he's the man of steel, and this is not going to fly.
Right.
But I appreciated him helping me avoid that landmine and being able to, despite myself, have some proper perspectives on dating.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, if anything for me, I remember not dating right was some of the other lessons I wish I could have remembered was just go and ask a girl out. I do kind of wish I could have just understood that sometimes just going out for ice cream or going out with a group of friends or going to a movie doesn't have to be anything more than that. I know that even when I was trying to ask a girl to go to prom, there were two girls who we actually had a German foreign exchange student at the time, and so we were kind of thinking, they'd be good friends. We'd have a good time with them, but there's nothing romantic. And we were kind of thinking, well, maybe they want to go with guys that they have a romantic interest in, but we really want to take these girls to prom because we'll have a good time and there won't be any stress about romance or anything else. So instead of asking them to prom, we just went around telling everybody that we were going to go with them to prom. And so before we knew it, is that sometimes called a bro code? Now, speaking of things I'm not hip on, we kind of trapped them by telling everybody else that we were going to take them to prom. And at some point they came up to us and they were like, "Are you taking us to prom?" And we're like, "Well, yeah, of course we are." And they're like, "Were you ever going to ask us?" And we were like, "How about now? Do you want to go to prom?" And by that point they were trapped. So
how cowardly.
It really
effective,
was.
But cowardly.
It was effective. And we all actually had a very nice time at prom. So wish I would have been a little more direct in that situation. Some of those things about dating rightly that did not quite pan out for me.
Well, it's funny now, since we're talking about dating, and this actually will help us transition to the point. Your point there was kind of a bridge between the last point I mentioned and the one I'd like to. It might be a good time to listen to Disclaimer Guy, because we're talking about dating, and there's not like a one kind of approach to dating. We really want our teens to talk to their parents and ask their parents about when they're ready for dating, what their parents would think. So let me go ahead and bring in Disclaimer Guy at this point. Disclaimer Guy, if you will.
When facing large decisions, be sure to seek your parents' help, guidance, and advice, not just the advice of faceless voices on a podcast.
Thank you very much, Disclaimer Guy. In fact, I was talking with someone, I think it was someone at the wedding this weekend, and who said that we've never introduced Disclaimer Guy. Who is Disclaimer Guy? So let me give Disclaimer Guy an opportunity to introduce himself. Disclaimer Guy, if you would introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Disclaimer Guy.
Thank you, Disclaimer Guy. We like to do things right around here on the Living Youth podcast. The bridge that I feel this is you talk about your parents, them helping you avoid landmines. One of the things that I wish I had done differently, that I would go back, and that is to honor my parents. And I don't want this to sound like I was frequently dishonoring them. I actually, I don't think my sister would disagree that between the two of us, I was probably seen as the one who was the more obedient. My sister was kind of the kind of go her own way, so which in the end is kind of funny because my mom was sort of that way, which ended up bonding my mom and my sister to a certain extent. They would kind of smoke and rebel together. I was really the obedient one to a certain extent, and I like to think I did honor my parents for the most part. However, there's a culture that we try to encourage everyone in the church to consider. And there's a very pro-family culture, to really see your family as your bastion of comfort and safety, and to think of that as your home base and really invest in your family. And now that I'm in my early 50s, both of my parents are dead, and I keep coming across questions that I wish I could ask them, and I can't. They're not here anymore. There's things I would love to ask them, even about myself, but questions about things we experience together or get their opinion. And I think of some things that I feel like my children know about me that I don't know about my parents. And part of why I don't is when I was younger, I was not investing in getting to know them. I wasn't the effort I was putting into all the other things I did in my life, I was not putting into getting to know my parents, trying to tap into their wisdom, to tap into their experience. You know what? I can't even tell you how my mother and father met, of all things, which makes me feel kind of bad. I feel like my children know how my wife and I met. I don't know. I'll quiz them later. But there's so many things I wish I knew, and I just don't. And God does encourage us to honor our parents. And I wish I understood more of that culture when I was younger, that it's not just a matter of doing what they say. It's not just a matter of obeying them. But if you honor your parents, you see them as someone of significance in your life, to the point that your relationship with them is worth your time. It's worth your investment. It's worth it's worth getting to know them, if it's worth getting to know anyone. And I wish I had spent more of my youth doing that. Does that make sense there, Mr. Sandor?
Oh, absolutely. Because I think that a lot of times we can look at the commandments, the 10 Commandments, and so many of them even start off with, thou shalt not. They're things to avoid doing. That if we're not careful, we don't see them as also being proactive in things that we should be doing. And so we can maybe honor our parents just by simply trying not to disobey them, rather than actually engage them and try to have some understanding. Now, it made me think of one verse, and I'm trying to see if I can find it real quick here. Oh, here we go. Okay, so this is Psalm 32 in verse 9. Psalm 32 in verse 9, where it says, "Do not be like the horse or like the mule, which have no understanding, which must be harnessed with bit and bridle, else they will not come near you." And it's kind of in this section where God is, where David is in this particular psalm, talking about instruction, talking about learning, talking about understanding things. And as you become more of a teenager, you get to start to have some, hopefully, understanding of why you're doing what you're doing, or why your parents are doing what they're doing. I was not perfectly understanding when my dad made a rule about where I was and not going to be with a girl, but I understand now looking back on it. But there are other things that, especially with my children, I have a 5-year-old and a 6-year-old, and I also have a 12-year-old and a 13-year-old. Well, the 5 and 6-year-old, a lot of times they just have to obey. They just have to be told what it is, and if they ask why, I may or may not answer their why question, because at the end of the day, you're 5 or 6, I'm going to have to answer this question again. The more important thing is, don't run in the road. Let's talk about the why later on. For the 12 and 13-year-old, if they want to know why, and they're asking respectfully and not just out of a rebellious attitude or something, but if they want to know why, I hope to be able to teach them that. Sometimes we can honor our parents by learning from what they're doing and approaching them and trying to seek that level of understanding that they might have too. We're not obligated to be Christians who are just, like horses and mules and don't have any understanding of what we're doing. And frequently our parents and their experience can be the first source of knowledge that we can go to help us out and to even understand our own decisions and their decisions.
Right. No, I appreciate that. I don't recall really discussing with my parents why some of their rules were what they were. I think I just took, like, for instance, curfews. I just took for granted, they don't want me to stay out late and get in trouble. But then you never know if I'd actually, spent the time to really talk with them about it. Maybe they could have explained about, personal experiences or something that might have actually given me a certain perspective on not just, they don't want me to get in trouble. If they knew me, they knew I wouldn't because I'm a good person. But also the kind of trouble you can get into. I think it's easy when and that's related to the unshakable unbreakables, what you're talking about, is it's easy to underestimate the kind of trouble you can get into because you don't have much, if you're 15, 16, 17, 18, even in your early adulthood, you don't have the kind of experience that opens up just what the world can do and the situations you can find yourself in, and we have to lean on that additional wisdom that our parents bring. So I'd like to move on to another one. I think this overlaps with one of yours, and I've worded it sort of oddly, but the wording that I use is something that I heard Mr. Weston say way back. I want to say 2000. 7 or 8. Is that the Missouri camp? I mean, not the Missouri camp, the Michigan camp. But he talked about not living life through an avatar. And I'm not talking about the cartoon Avatar, The Last Airbender, nor am I talking about the new movie of giant blue space Smurfs, but the idea of something virtual or even imaginary that represents you so that you're experiencing, so your life, quote unquote, is actually mainly what's online or is mainly in a game of some sort, but that you seek to live life in the real world And I didn't understand that quite so much when I was young. And for me, video games weren't, well, we did have some. I had a Commodore 64. If anyone wants to Google Commodore 64, you will see the brilliant, amazing high-tech computer that was. That's where I learned to program a little bit, the first part of my life. And so I did have some games, had an Atari before that. But for me, though, the big time-consuming thing was, and this is not a recommendation, this is me simply explaining what I've done before, but was Dungeons and Dragons, was role-playing games. And we had several. We had that. There was one called Villains and Vigilantes, which clearly was a ripoff idea-wise of Dungeons and Dragons, but it was more about, like comic book type heroes and villains. But my friends and I, we'd spend all this time, right, doing those things. And on one hand, it'd be one thing if it were board games where you kind of do it and then you kind of go away and come back. But they weren't just board games. I mean, even outside of the game, you're working on building different characters and designing certain things. And I was the quote unquote dungeon master for a lot of what we did. So I was, kind of working on, well, all of that was a huge investment that wasn't an investment in the real world. It wasn't, and don't get me wrong, like I've talked to my wife, it encouraged a lot of imagination, to be sure, but you can't tell me there isn't something healthier outside of those things where imagination can be encouraged, but you're also interacting with the real world. It reminds me of a joke where a guy, I don't think it's real at all, but it was a joke online. It said, "Oh, I finally got my grandkids to help me dig in the garden. I just told them it was like Minecraft, but in real life." And like, oh, they're all excited, they went out. Now, of course, they think that's a joke, and I'm not necessarily knocking Minecraft in creative mode. I actually think it can be a lot of fun. However, all those things that have to be balanced. Every time you're in front of a screen, you're not in front of a human. You're not in front of something real and tangible. And I wish I had known to put that kind of activity in a certain perspective. In John chapter 10 and verse 10, let me see, I'm not turning there now. Let me turn there. When I say turn, I mean tap. Mr. Sandor is here doing old school Bible with actual paper. I've got my computer up. Jesus Christ tells us that one of the reasons he has come is that we may have life and have it more abundantly. And personally, I can reflect on the hours and hours I spent on these other things, sort of living life through an avatar, if you will, as less of an abundant life. It was a less abundant life. In fact, I would encourage, we'll try to add a link to this post if I remember to do so. Mr. Rod McNair has written some articles about doing hard things. The recent one was just last year in March. He's asking, will you do hard things? And this idea of seeing your youth as a time to invest your energies in those things that will lay a foundation for your future and will grow your personality, even your personality, your character in certain ways. And that takes real effort. And all that effort I was doing those things, when I can reflect now, looking back, those were a little more stagnant to a certain extent. There was less growth in my life because of those times. And I wish I could kind of go back and understand that better. Don't spend so much time living life through an avatar or something that represents you in a fictional sense. Instead, try to spend more time on real life. And I appreciate how our camps try to encourage kids to do that. You're spending 2 weeks, and it's kind of hard to spend time as an avatar with the kind of schedules we give to the kids and try to keep them involved in real life and real people.
I believe this is one that I felt some overlap in this. I believe my point was just kind of titled "The Emptiness of Breaking the Sabbath," so that might actually flow into your fourth one here as well, because I found that looking back, if I was to go back and talk to my teenage self, they would probably say, "Oh, but look at everything I'm doing on Friday nights or on Saturdays or whatever," and for me to simply tell them it's pretty vain. It's you're like. Right, you're playing now I did not get into Dungeons and Dragons, but if that was the type of thing I'm doing, or I'm missing watching a movie for a night, or I'm missing such and such for so many of the activities I did were just activities that could have easily been put off until after the Sabbath and still been fine afterwards. But the emptiness of those types of things, I sometimes even wonder with just fiction in general that I don't mind fiction. I really enjoyed Star Wars when I was growing up. That was probably my go-to. And if I wasn't careful, I could just be reading those books. I could be playing those types of games. I could be watching the movies, and in a limited degree, might not be the end of the world. But now we even talk about just the idea of binge watching shows and binging on a fake world, a world that's just not there. I have tried to enjoy reading books at this point in my life, and I still enjoy reading some fictional books, but I definitely try to keep it balanced between nonfiction and fiction, and usually, hopefully, a little bit heavier on the nonfiction side of things, because it's okay to have some degree of entertainment, but it has to be kept in balance, and it's really easy for it to grow out of balance and consume better uses of your time.
Yeah, I find that some of the boys are reading more nonfiction books, than they did when they were younger, and some of those are books you can read earlier. You don't have to wait until you're an adult. And to read some of those books that can be really helpful, and I appreciate that, because I certainly had no sense when I was a teenager that even Sunday, I was a Sunday keeper because I didn't know any better, right? That's what we're talking about. But I still didn't think of that day as sacred space, as time that should be devoted to things with some kind of eternal value. Sunday was, the day I mowed the lawn. Saturday I was goofing off. Sunday would go to church with my dad and see my grandparents there. And then I often got to mow the lawn later on Sunday. So I didn't have a sense of a day set apart for sacred space. And I appreciate that insight, Mr. Sandor, because I think, yes, I would have benefited from that, from knowing that. Think of the kind of relationship you have the potential to have with God if over the course of your early life, you are literally making sure one day in 7 is reserved for Him and for the things of Him. I think Mr. Robinson would be proud of us at the time we're making, by the way, so far. I think we're doing well.
Sure.
Let's assume that he would be proud of us. I had only one more that I wanted to discuss, and that was and this is, again, it's actually a little bit of a bridge here. I wish I could go back to my younger self and share with him what I know now about the impact of my entertainment choices, the things that I choose to actually entertain myself with. Whether you were talking about fiction just a while ago, because I definitely was diving into a lot of fiction, and again, it's not necessarily terrible. The verse that I wish I could impress upon myself when I was younger is a classic when it comes to trying to evaluate whether you should allow yourself to indulge in a particular form of entertainment or something. There's others. For instance, you want to be able to do all things in Christ's name. Can I actually read this book and feel like I'm doing so in a way that I would not mind if Christ's name were branded on me while I did so? But this verse, I think, is a standout. It's Philippians 4:8, a classic in terms of trying to evaluate whether something is worth my time. The Apostle Paul says in Philippians 4:8, "Finally, brethren, whatever things are true, whatever things are noble, whatever things are just, whatever things are pure, whatever things are lovely, whatever things are of good report, if there is any virtue and if there is anything praiseworthy, meditate on these things." And your time spent with entertainment it's not exactly the same as meditation, of course. If I recall, and I could be wrong, I need to ask someone like Mr. Peter Nathan if he remembers. But I thought I remember reading something about whether it's the Hebrew word for meditation or another one that it's like a conversation you have with yourself. But it's certainly turning things over, kind of in your mind. Well, when it comes to entertainment, you are actually giving yourself over to someone, whether it's an author, whether it's a director or an actor, or for that matter, a singer. You are essentially handing yourself over to that person for that amount of time and saying, hey, I'm giving you permission to prick my emotions in a certain way. I'm giving you permission to fill my mind with some examples. Because as I mentioned way back in my split on Fake World, our brain is designed to take in examples, and it doesn't always do the kind of filtering we think it should do, whether that example is fictional or not. And so I would want to go back and examine the stories and the movies and the music I listen to and ask myself, does this really fit in Philippians 4:8? You bring up fiction. Fiction can. I know someone, for instance, who's really into the Anne of Green Gables stories, and when she was young, just loved listening to reading those. And there are works of fiction that in the end, just like like a lot of good stories, they end up emphasizing virtues or emphasize loyalty, emphasize something. Well, now of course in this world so many things are tainted because the world is an imperfect place, and you have to be careful about what might be carried along with those things. For instance, I'm going to use I'm not going to mention the novel, but it was a number of years ago, and it was eventually turned into a movie. And I remember it being praised as a woman who is discovering herself and discovering that she is a person of value and all these things about, I don't know, esteem and her. Well, how does she come to this place? If you listen to this, you read the story, she comes to it through adultery. That by pursuing an adulterous affair, she has all these wonderful things, come into her life. Well, that's the thing about fiction. You're creating a world because you're essentially the kind of like the god, quote unquote, of that world. So you can reward characters for their choices. You can punish characters for their other choices. And this writer chose to reward this fictional woman for her choice to commit adultery. Well, there's no way I was into that book when I was a kid. It was actually written after I was a kid, and I thought it was a dumb book then. But thankfully, I was attending the church by then. But I would go back and I would examine the comedians that I listened to. I would examine the movies that I watched, the music, and I wish I could inject in my brain of my younger self what I know now, which is, man, Philippians 4:8. Keep those things in mind. I'll mention one example post-conversion is after I was baptized. I remember sitting with it was a summer break from when I was in college, and sitting with my mother and a friend, and we were watching on cable, and I'll go ahead and mention the comedian's name, Chris Rock. And it was early in Chris Rock's career. He wasn't quite he wasn't a big enough star to get slapped by Will Smith yet. He was an up and coming sort of guy, comedian. He would have cable specials. And he was so vulgar. I don't know if he still is because I haven't watched an entire Chris Rock. I think I've seen clips that are clean enough I could watch. But at the time, that was part of his shtick, was a lot of vulgarity. And this is after I've been baptized, but I'm kind of doing I'll just say, I don't want to dishonor my parents, I mentioned earlier, but they were not always as selective as they should have been with the entertainment they enjoyed with their children. What they enjoyed themselves, frankly. Again, they were not in the church and they didn't have the benefit of these things either. And so my mother's there, my friend and I, and we're watching this Chris Rock special, and he makes this really vulgar joke, and I just laugh. It was so funny. But at the same time, thankfully, whether this was God's Spirit in me starting to prick my heart or whether it was just common sense, I did think to myself, oh, wait a minute. I can't actually be watching this with Jesus right next to me, and I hope he's in my life. I've got him in my life now. I'm baptized, and this isn't an excuse to put that off because, of course, Christ is always with us and watching. But I had to think it wasn't just the idea that here I am doing this, but rather I didn't like the fact that I thought it was funny. I didn't like the fact that the person I was would be entertained by what I had just heard instead of appalled by what I had just heard. Because I knew that Christ wouldn't think that was funny. He would actually have quite a few choice words to say about it. And yet in me, I thought it was hilarious. So I realized it's not just a matter of doing different things. I wanted to be a different person. And the person I was at that time, which thankfully we grow, and I appreciate that I've grown. I haven't grown enough, but I'm grateful for the growth I've had. But the person I was at the time who thought those things were hilarious was a person who'd been shaped by my entertainment choices, among other things, leading up to that point in my life. So I wish I could go back and get younger me thinking differently about his entertainment choices.
And I definitely feel the same way. I think for so many of the entertainment choices that I made, and my parents were a little bit more restrictive on what I was watching than I guess. I don't think they would have let me watch Chris Rock. I think even for them, listening to music was usually about Neil Diamond and Barry Manilow more than that was the type
two
of
my
music.
faves, by the way.
Okay, good. But that was that. Everything else was a little too hard rock for them, so they were pretty careful about what we were listening to and what we were watching. But even that only had its limits, especially as I was becoming an older teenager. And it's very interesting how humor in particular, and maybe this is because this is one of my next points that we might get to, can really shape our thinking and really shape our communication. I think there can occasionally be times, if you actually find a really good comedian to listen to, that can be very fun and might help you realize how to incorporate humor into your own life if you're doing it properly, because it might just be about how you tell a story or how to deliver a punchline, which you can kind of get from some of these things.
Yeah, there are some good, clean comedians these days that do that really well.
But that wasn't what I was listening to growing up. Well, it depends on which one. But one in particular, they even had a set of movies. I'm almost hesitant to share which one it was, but the first movie came out before I was attending or doing anything, and I thought it was hilarious. And then the second one came out, and at that point, I forget if I was even attending the church, but I had certainly started to focus more on biblical values by that point in my life. And by going to that second movie, I remember thinking, this doesn't feel right or funny anymore. Did I really laugh so much at the first one? And by the time the third movie came out, I didn't even bother buying a ticket or anything. It was just one of those series of movies that, as I was maturing, the humor might not have changed, but my standards for it certainly did. So it would have been nice to have not even had the seeds planted from the first movie in the first place. That would have been great. But
by the way, I don't want to come across as endorsing Neil Diamond and Barry Manilow. My father-in-law used to call Barry Manilow barely man enough. But because, it's funny when you really are examining, like Barry Manilow is a good example. The guy can be so depressing. It's a lot of, destroyed relationships, but it sounds good. He was emo before emo was a thing, I think.
Never thought of it that way.
Yeah, and really, really kind of a downer. And I'd have to look back and think even his stuff, I don't think a lot of it would fit through the Philippians 4:8 filter.
But this brings us back to whether we're hip or not. Is emo still a thing now, or are we dating ourselves by using that?
Probably. Tell you what, this is a good time to mention it. Our email works now. If anyone has been trying to email us at podcast@livingyouth.org, you have found probably that it doesn't work for you. I have been informed by our wonderful IT department that it does now work. There was some kind of switch that had to be flipped for it to be able to take emails from outside of lcg.org. So if you would like to let me and Mr. Sandor know, you guys are so hip and right on, and we all say emo now, feel free and email us at podcast@livingyouth.org. Or if you want to say, you have no idea the new and exciting vocabulary that we're all indulging in these days, feel free and email us that too. Also, if you have ideas for future podcasts, if you have questions about the Bible or Christian living that you'd like us to address and talk about these topics and how to think about them biblically, again, that's podcast@livingyouth.org. Thank you, Mr. Sandor, for allowing me that commercial.
Sure. So I had two other points that
great.
I was hoping to mention briefly. Like I said, my first two kind of overlapped with your list there. And one that I know I wish I could go back and tell my teenage self, and I don't know if I have the exact proper way of putting this, but I would have told myself to be far more careful with my sense of humor and how I communicated with people a little bit more generally. I know that I still enjoy trying to make a joke, trying to make people laugh. It was part of the reason to listen to comedians or go see funny movies and other things, was to see, could I take a joke from that and pull it off in my own life. But one of the things that we very frequently find with worldly humor is that it is just insulting and demeaning to somebody. Even the Barry Manilow one, was at his expense, to change the name a little bit. And so I wish I could go back, because I know that I said far too many things where I was trusting people not to be offended by my sense of humor and realized that, I'm only joking. Which, needless to say, there's a proverb about. And so if it's in Proverbs 26, verses 18 and 19, where it says, like a madman throwing firebrands, arrows, and death is the man who deceives his neighbor and says, I was only joking. Now, I don't think I was necessarily straight up lying to people, deceiving them, and then trying to excuse myself by saying I was only joking. But I just think of some really. I wish I could go back and talk to myself, right? When I think about this topic.
For the benefit of the audience, I'm looking at his face, and he looks so pained right now. Clearly, this is traumatic for him.
It is. Because I used that excuse at the very least. I was only joking. I thought that was practically a get out of jail free card. That I said that, but of course I'm only joking, and so everybody should know it. Besides, didn't you hear everybody laugh? Okay, right. But they're laughing at your expense, and so I might have a little bit more in common as a teenager of that madman throwing firebrands, arrows, and death. So if I could go back and help with communication, humor in specific, that humor can be used very positively. It can build people up. I mean, I think when a group of people laugh together in a good and healthy way, it really can help build friendships, build community, build congregations to a degree. But not all laughter is the same, and so having that the right way, and even just with communication, I can't help but notice one of the other verses here in Proverbs 26, since I was going for verse 18 and 19, and verse 17 right before it says, "He who passes by and meddles in a quarrel not his own is like one who takes a dog by the ears," and that one certainly jumps out at me as being something back in my teenage years, and one that I'm very thankful during my teenage years Facebook was not around, or other social media in general was not around. I felt like I had to learn that lesson again when Facebook became a thing, and realizing that there's a lot of quarrels that are not my own that are presented there, or that we had, believe it or not, there were actually quarrels before Facebook too, and you could meddle in them as well. And most of the time, if it's not your own, just walk on by or
let it go.
Let it go. Keep it to yourself. Allow other people to handle the situation. And obviously, there's so many proverbs about communication. I'm not going to pretend to cover all of them, but that one being right here in the same section with the madman throwing firebrands, arrows, and death caught my eye. Would have been just a very helpful snippet of proverbs to go back and remind myself of as a teenager. I do have one more. My last one was to be okay with learning. I think as a teenager, I sort of thought that learning was something I was going to do in school, and I was going to master certain topics, and then that schooling was eventually going to end, and the majority of my learning would be done, and then the practicing of it would come into place. And needless to say, in the church with the Bible, that is simply not the case. First off, as a 20-year-old, I still knew next to nothing about the Bible. I'm amazed at how ignorant I was of so many things. I guess if we're in the book of Proverbs, how simple I was on so many things regarding the Bible at that point. And now, having lived God's way of life for 20 plus years, if anything, I feel like I've started to comprehend how much more I have to learn, and that is going to be a lifetime process. That this is not something I'm going to reach the end of during this life, any more than for so many of the topics you might study in school are very similar to that. That you're not going to get to the end of high school or end of college or whatever and know everything about everything with history. You just won't. There's going to be so many other books, so many other stories that you could go down and study. Maybe you'll know enough to get by, and that's fine. That you don't have to always be reading a new history book per se, but there's going to be parts of history that you just don't know about after 12 years in homeschool, public school, and however many years of college after that. There's going to be more that you can keep on learning, and so to not view learning as like a destination, but a journey that we're going to continue to be on. And I think it'll be very interesting to see, even looking out in the future of God's church becoming spirit beings, and how much learning we might still do even at that point as spirit beings. It always just kind of fascinates me to be thinking about the fact that it might not ever be a true destination, but could just be a journey that goes on for quite longer than we might expect.
I appreciate what you're saying, because you can start to feel that way in high school or college, that I just can't wait till all of this is over. I'm so tired of just trying to cram things in my brain. Well, part of that is the burden of it's a bunch of stuff you don't care about to a certain extent.
Yes.
But at the same time, even then, those who pursue only learning about the things they 100% really are passionate about are the people that are actually missing out on a great deal. There's times you go through books of the Bible not because, oh, this is my favorite book of the Bible. Well, no, it's because I want to know the Bible overall, and that includes some of these maybe harder, drier passages. And if to summarize or paraphrase what I think I hear you saying is you wish you could go back to your previous self, it's still you, but younger self, and help you learn that learning is a worthwhile activity, and don't think it's something you're going to put behind you. It's something that you need to learn to enjoy, because the whole rest of your life is going to involve learning.
Correct. And in particular, it was definitely one of those lessons that I felt like had to transition as I was joining the church, because I guess I was hoping by the time I was 20, 21, 22, like I would have learned the majority of what I was going to learn in my life. And then, if you're a youth in the church and you're hitting 20, 21, 22, and you feel like you still have so much to learn about the Bible, great, because you do.
Don't feel bad for that.
And that's the thing, and there's nothing wrong with it. There is nothing wrong with it. Be okay with that. Admit it, own it. I believe it was Mr. White who had, you might remember
Thomas
the commentary. White? Yes, sir. About the God's book.
Oh, God's complicated book.
Yes,
or
I feel like we shared that article. And how it is a complicated book, and to learn the book takes decades. And I would imagine if we had our pastors who are older than us in here, who do have decades more experience at all of this than Mr. Smith and I do, they would say there's still learning, or that there's still room for growth, and that
they wouldn't count themselves as having mastered the entire book.
And so when you're 20, you're not approaching the end of a learning experience. Maybe you've learned a lot so that you can have a job and be able to provide for your family. We hope that for the men, they've been able to figure that out, and for the ladies, they've learned enough to fulfill whatever desires they have going forward, hopefully with marriage and family and all of that. When you're talking about the Bible, if you ever feel like I just don't know as much as I should, don't let that beat you up. Don't let Satan try to throw that in you and discourage you, because most of us have needed decades. And at least for Mr. Smith and I know that my process of learning any of that didn't even really start till I was already out of my teenage years.
Oh, absolutely. I like I said, I'm in my early 50s, and I still feel like I have so much ahead that I wish I understood better. Wow. Well, if any of our listeners out there have some sort of time traveling technology and can take this podcast and go find a young Mr. Smith, a young Mr. Sandor, and force them in some way, if you're a time traveler, you probably have the ability to intimidate someone to sit down and say, hey, older you wants you to listen to this. Please do so. We give you permission to speak to our younger selves on our behalf, but also for your lives. We hope that you will examine the things you're learning in God's church, whether you've gone to camp or not, what you're hearing in services, what you're hearing from your parents concerning this way of life that God does seek to communicate to us and long for us to live. We hope that you'll reflect on your life here in your youth. Some of it you won't fully grasp until you're older, because you do need more perspective, and it takes time to gain a lot of that perspective. But you can get a head start now by trying to even discuss with your parents, why this way of life truly is a better one, and how you might be benefiting from it. And thank you, Mr. Sandor, for stepping in and filling those shoes.
Thanks for having me.
You bet. Sandor.